Hello everyone and welcome to the first game we'll be showing from round 8 of this year's Norway Chess. It's Aryan Tari versus Magnus Carlsen, and this is their Armageddon game. The classical game ended fairly quickly, not a lot has happened in the game. Tari had some pressure in the position, but it was nothing serious. Magnus played a very silly move in the opening. He said it so himself in the confessional, and he said that hopefully it confuses Tari just enough to at least waste time on it. But okay, the game resulted in a draw, and this is now the Armageddon game. As you know, in Norway Chess there are no drawn matches. So Tari with the white pieces opens with e4, and Magnus brought something fun to the party. He plays b6. He plays the Owen's defense, and it's always fun when someone does that. d4 by Tari, grabbing the center, which is what you want to do if your opponent doesn't control the center. Bishop to b7, and now knight to c3. Bishop to d3 is still the most popular move, but we have knight to c3 here, and d6. We have f4, and now knight to d7. So very, very weird stuff happening here. This is not a position you will see every day. Knight to f3, and now it is already as of move 5 that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Magnus continues. We have pawn to e6 and bishop to d3 now, adding more defense to this e4 pawn, and now c5, challenging the center. Here you have to decide whether to push d5 or not, but you know, if Magnus plays c5, then d5 is what he wants you to play. So here Tari just ignores him. He plays castles, and now c captures on d4. We have knight captures on d4 and knight g to f6. And for those of you who maybe do not know, Tari is the second highest rated player in Norway, Magnus being the first one. The difference in ELO between the two of them is, I believe, 200 points, maybe even 201 points to be exact. So not a pretty big difference. So here knight to f6, and now queen to e2. You could rush with f5 right away, but it's always unpleasant playing Magnus when Magnus only needs a draw to win the game, as this is Armageddon. So here we have a6, and now pawn to a4. Here, instead of pawn to a4, I will just show a super fun line that starts with e5, as well, the black king is still in the center of the board. We should try and do something about this, and the point is, if d captures on e5, there's knight captures on e6, and the position that we'll get from this is so incredible, but it's maybe that Tari just decided that maybe he will not be able to force a win against Magnus from this position. For example, f captures on e5, and now you can't move the knight. If you move the knight, you just get checkmated. Queen h6 check, g6, we give up the bishop, captures with check, and queen f7 will be checkmate. So instead, what you would have to do after f captures on e5 is just give the knight back with knight captures on e5, for example. But first you're gonna deliver a check, king h1. Now you're gonna play knight captures on e5, queen captures on e5, and you get this position where white is better, but black with the nasty bishop pair, it's maybe something not to try in an Armageddon game. So okay, a4, we have bishop to e7 by Magnus, and now bishop to d2. Tari just continues development, castles, and now king to h1. Always a nice prophylactic idea. Knight to c5 by Magnus, putting more pressure on the e4 pawn. That's kind of what you want to do if you play the Owen's opening. And now rook a to e1. We have d5, now striking in the center, and Magnus advances the pawn to e5. We have knight f to e... Sorry, Tari advances the pawn to e5. Knight f to e4, and here we have pawn to f5, and you can see that white is doing great progress here. If Magnus captures, then just knight captures on f5 is a very, very enjoyable position for white. So Magnus doesn't want to give white such a positional advantage. He tries bishop to g5 because he doesn't want his bishop on f7 when f6 lands. So here bishop to g5, and now again Tari has a chance to go for a very, very cool maneuver, but he doesn't. Here he played bishop captures on g5, but it's more precise to play bishop captures on e4 first. Point being that after d captures on e4, or knight captures, doesn't really matter. You're gonna capture the knight, and the position will be similar. But after d captures on e4, now we capture the bishop on g5, and after queen captures, we can chase away this knight with b4. Also one of the nicer ideas, removing one of the defenders of the e4 pawn, and once the knight moves, knight captures on d4. Yes, it looks scary because we open up this diagonal, but the black queen has to leave the g file, and once the black queen moves, now we play knight to d6, attack the bishop here, and the bishop cannot remain on this diagonal. So we're just going to capture it, and the best for black is just to capture. For example, knight captures here, and if queen captures on b4, we bust open the position with f6. So this is one of the possibilities. But after bishop captures on g5, you do not have the time for that. Magnus plays queen captures on g5, and now we have rook to f3. Preparing to harass the queen a little bit after the knight moves from e4. Now comes e captures on f5 and rook captures on f5, attacking Magnus's queen. Safest is to go back. Magnus keeps the queen here to help out with the defense, but also with the attack. And now rook to h5, challenging the queen here, queen to g6, and now knight to f5. And here, the position is pretty equalish. White is a little bit better, but you can see that white has a whole lot of pressure, and it's very, very uncomfortable just playing this with black. The queen is in a terrible square, and all of these pieces in front of the black king. But okay, Magnus plays rook a to e8. It's a calm move, even the strongest move recommended by the engine. And now Tari captures on e4. Bishop captures, we have d captures. He wants to grab hold of the d6 square, and it doesn't matter if you capture with the knight. We first eliminate the knight, and then we play knight to d6. Or if d captures on e4, which is what Magnus played, knight to d6, now attacking the rook and the bishop. And here you have to play rook to e7 and continue playing this passively, which kind of is what you should do. It's an Armageddon game. If it's a draw, black just wins, so it kind of makes sense to force white to go for the win. But Magnus plays rook captures on e5. He gives up the exchange. He removes the defender of the knight, and now he says, do you want to capture my rook? And it's well, it's the only move for white that's actually good. So rook captures on e5, and now we have queen captures on d6. We have rook to f5, and interestingly, this rook to f5 probably is what maybe Magnus missed. This is the only move that allows white to keep the advantage, because if black can play f5, f4, f3, then the position just opens up, and it will be black who's attacking. So with rook to f5, he prevents the pawn from being pushed all the way. And okay, now Magnus can decide whether to just maybe keep an eye on this e4 pawn, or to try and squeeze in that f5 move. So he plays g6, and now rook to d1 first. A nice in-between move, challenging the queen, and here queen to e6. If you're wondering what happens if we just take the two rooks for the queen, which can be a good idea, here the problem is you already sacrificed material. So now, after all is said and done, you will not have two rooks for the queen, but rather you will have a bishop and the rook for a queen. So it's not as good, and it's very easy to just get a better position with white. For example, bishop c8, defend the pawn, knight here, and the pawn will now fall. So after rook to d1, queen to e6 by Magnus, and now rook f back to f1. And now, okay, you could play f5, but you've already played g6, so now it might be a little too much to open up your king like that as well. So instead, Magnus plays queen to e5, and now we have queen to e3. We have pawn to a5, and now king to g1, getting the king closer to the center of the board. If the position opens up, or if, for example, everything gets traded off, you won't have to worry about any mate threats. So rook to e8, and now rook to f2. We have finally f5 by Magnus, and now pawn to g3, stopping this f4 idea. King to g7, and now knight to b5. We have rook to e7, and now pawn to b3. So just solidifying the position, keeping everything safe. We have knight to e6 now by Magnus, trying to get that knight somewhere in the game, also preventing knight to d4. But now comes knight to d6. Knight to d4 is also a good idea, actually, because any trades go in white's favor. But knight to d6 was played, and here Magnus plays bishop to a6, going after just keeping the bishop in the game and putting it to this diagonal. But here queen to c5 was actually very interesting, as the queen is undefended. So here you kind of force a queen trade, and if queens get traded off, for example, queen captures, we're going to play b captures, and create sort of an imbalance in the position, but black is still in the game. However, Magnus played bishop to a6, and now we have pawn to c4. Just making that bishop useless, and also this is now a terrible pawn. We can just capture it whenever we want. So here knight to c5, preventing the capture, but here Magnus missed one very, very strong idea for Tari. So feel free to pause the video here and win the game for Tari while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding any of the cool winning ideas. Rook to d5 and rook to g5, these are all fine, but there is one that just ends the game, and congratulations to everyone who spotted it. Knight captures on f5. That's the good stuff, and now there is, well, really nothing you can do. The king and rook are forked. You have to capture, otherwise you're going to lose even more material. So g captures on f5, and now queen to g5 with check. And now you can see that the black king is getting checkmated, the rook is coming to f5, and that's it. This rook has access to the d8 square. There is no defending this. Magnus plays king to h8, but other moves aren't better either. So here rook captures on f5, and it was in this position on move 37 that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game, and Tari gets his first victory in the Armageddon, as so far he lost all of them in Norway Chess 2022. But instead of rook captures on f5, you could also play rook to d8 check, which is maybe even cooler. Point is that after rook to e8, we're going to play rook captures on f5, attack the queen, and after queen to a1 check, king to g2, queen to b2 with check, king h3. There is now no more checks, and you will have to resign this. If you capture on d8, we're just going to capture with the queen. King to g7, and now queen to g5 check will result in checkmate. But now that I think about it, I think Tari's rook captures on f5 is the cooler move, because after rook captures on f5, where Magnus resigned, point is that there is now no defense. You can't defend against the rook to d8, and if you play something like queen b8 defending this, we can even sacrifice the rook to d8 with check, and once the queen captures, now we play queen to f6 with check. And the point is, if you play rook to g7, now the queen hangs, that's why we sacrifice the rook, and if you play king to g8, then it's the matter of the very simple rook g5 check, rook to g7 now being the only move, and queen captures checkmate. Or you can harass your opponent by capturing the queen, but you know, it's polite to end the game as soon as possible if you see it. So yeah, after rook captures on f5, Magnus resigns, and a very, very nice victory for Aryan Tari, who not only wins his match against Magnus Carlsen, but also wins quite a bit of rating points in the classical as he drew his game against Magnus. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We're not gonna spoil the results of the other matches, as we are going to show at least one more before we check out the standings after this round. But this is a pretty big deal. Magnus does not gain an extra point in Armageddon, and it's a chance for the other players to catch up, as Carlsen is leading the tournament for the moment. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Be careful when playing the Owens defense. It looks very cool, but it is very hard to play it against anyone. I would like to thank Cedar Simmons, Evalia and Lego, Charles Huff, Nagarjuna Ponogoti, and David Kimura for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions, and of course continuing the Norway Chess 2022 until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.